I've known Joan for I've known Joan for the last almost a year. She's been one of the highlights of my life during that time. Joan is a scholar and an activist. She's somebody who does deep research and writes books and articles about a range of issues, most of which turn on some form of a divide. She's been deeply involved in feminism and writing about issues of gender. And at the same time that Joan is a strong feminist, she's also somebody who's deeply empathetic to the challenges that men face in modern society. In the same way, Joan is an academic as a professor at the University of California School of Law in Hastings. And while she has all of these academic credentials, as you're about to hear, she's also a plain talking person who connects with and relates to people without a lot of formal education, working class folks and others. So Joan has, over her long career, been very influential and a leader in issues of class, in issues of gender, race, and most recently, her focus on this divide across education. She hosted a convening of a couple dozen people just this past November. I was privileged to be part of that, focused on the diploma divide and how we can begin to grapple with this more effectively. So with all of that said, I'm just thrilled to introduce our speaker today, Joan Williams.
Thank you, Anthony. And I want to start out saying how deeply I admire Anthony and Erica and Ruby and what you folks are trying to accomplish. I think it's a really important effort in contemporary politics. So I'm going to be talking today about bridging the diploma divide. Is there a divide? There is. Between 1996 and 2018, the percentage of Democrats who are college grads doubled. And in 2022, Republicans won the white non-college voters by 34 points, up 9 points from 2018. Now it's true the rich are the most likely to vote for Trump. It is no surprising that Republicans vote for Republicans. That is definitely true. But what's shocking is that nearly 2/3 of white non-college voters did too. And this is 41% of the electorate. So Democrats need an overwhelming percentage of people of color to make up for that loss in presidential elections. And they just simply can't make up for the loss in House elections and state legislatures. And of course, we've seen since the overruling of Roe v. Wade, if we didn't know before that, that state legislatures are extremely important. But between 2012 and 2020, people of color shifted away from Democrats by 10 points. So that in 2020, 39% of Latino non-college grads voted for Trump. At that point, the Democrats just don't have any kind of a winning coalition. In addition to being stuck with the map, as you no doubt know, where you have blue coasts, but an ocean of red in between. So there is a diploma divide. It affects people of color as well as white working class people. And it's extremely important to figure out how to bridge it. Now, you may have heard that there's no diploma divide. This is just really about racism. And as Anthony mentioned, I have studied during my long career race, class, and gender. I take race very seriously. I've actually done 9 studies of structural racism in organizations. Now, and there are 3 different measures of racism that predict Trump voting better than class does. That is true. Race is playing a very important part of this picture. However, that's not why Trump won. Because those voters who are driven by racial resentment, they're not enough voters to win. The reason that Trump won is because he also attracted voters, a much larger group of voters with only moderate levels of racial resentment. So who are these voters? There are two groups. In 2016, there were two groups of Trump non-college voters who were overwhelmingly not college graduates and economically progressive. One was called the preservationists, the other the anti-elites. This is from a 2017 report called 5 Types of Trump Voters. The preservationists, they're very focused on being white and Christian. They have very cold feelings towards people of color. This is not a group that Democrats are probably going to be able to build a bridge to. So moving on, that's 20% of Trump voters. On the other hand, there's a second group of overwhelmingly non-college Trump voters called the anti-elites. And the anti-elites actually have, if you look at that feelings thermometers, they have feelings towards people of color that are about as warm as non-Trump voters. They're also moderate on climate change, moderate on abortion, and they were actually the group of Republican voters that was most in favor of gay marriage. What we need in the Democratic Party is a laser focus on the anti-elites. This 19% of chiefly non-college Trump voters who delivered the presidency to him. Now, these are not the poor, something that is often overlooked. And there's a lot of studies that say there is no diploma divide. Poor people didn't vote for Trump, and that's true. The people who voted for Trump not only in the US, but throughout Europe, there are rigorous transnational studies, are middle status voters holding on to routine jobs and by the skin of their teeth and fearful of falling out of the middle class. It's the fragile and failing middle class that is going not only for Trump, but throughout Europe towards the far right. Many studies that purport to find that economics is not predicting Trump voting, they just don't focus on the right group. Too often, I think, as I always say, there's nothing complicated about me. I'm a San Francisco liberal who studies race, class, and gender. Too often, people in my crowd assume that the path forward is to fix kind of racist, election-denying, conspiracy-minded non-college voters. But in my view, what we need to do to bridge the diploma divide is to fix a broken relationship between college grads and non-college grads. Often people assume, people who are focused on class assume that the key is to avoid culture wars and focus only on economics, on good jobs for non-college grads. But as we see, Biden has done that pretty consistently, and it's necessary, but it is not sufficient. We need to go deeper and recognize, and this is one of the things that the media scholars and the Bridging the Diploma Divide Working Group have taught me, precisely how the right bonds with non-college voters through rage. Populism basically harnesses the economic anger against the merchant right and redirects it against the Brahman Left, to use Thomas Piketty's term. The left's move, since the right is bonding through rage, is to bond with non-college voters through respect. but that means we actually have to respect them. That entails building cultural competence, because if you look at people who study inequality, sociologists and social psychologists, what they find is that non-elites hold different values than elites do. And that's because class is expressed through cultural differences. Different classes, they have different values, they have different traditions of talk, they have different attitude towards tradition itself. That's what I call the class culture gap. This stems from the work of a French sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu. And what the problem is that the Brahman left lacks the cultural competence to understand blue-collar values, as well as how our own values reflect our lives, and our lives reflect our privilege. So here's how blue-collar values reflect blue-collar lives. In college grads tend to be very focused on merit and tend to hang our honor on the fact that we went to college, we went to X college, we did great, we have Y job, we have won the merit game. Blue collar folks, they haven't won the merit game. And so what they do is what all psychologically robust people do. They find other baskets that they can fill. And while the elites are very focused on merits, non-elites gain social honor through morality and tradition. That's their source of feeling accomplished and whole and with dignity. Being traditional and family-oriented gives them a sense of their own success in moral terms, as opposed to the unattainable economic terms of the American dream. This is a quote from Michelle Lamont, another member of the Bridging the Diploma Divide working group. So merit versus morality is the first part of the class culture gap that we have to bridge. The second is the difference between self-development and self-discipline. Again, my crowd is very focused on self-development. And you can see this in how we raise our kids. We raise our kids so that a good mom, good parent, but really a good mom, your goal is to discover like every little micro talent and develop the kids, develop it to the nth power. That's why you have 700 million after school sports and activities. Because to succeed in a professional job, you have to be at the top of your game. So self-merit, self-actualization, self-development is very central to upper middle class culture. Self-actualization is not really on offer in working class jobs. And so again, they seek baskets that they can fill. They are focused not on self-development, but on self-discipline. And this is a quote from a memoir of a reporter whose dad was a bricklayer. He talked about his dad. He said he had a well-developed work ethic, the kind that gets you up early and keeps you locked in until the job is done, regardless of how odious or personally distasteful the task. Pride in self-discipline, pride in hard work is very, very central to blue-collar honor in what I call the scrum for social honor. That's very tied in with, very closely related to rural values, having to do with pride in hard work. So that focus on self-discipline leads to also a high value placed not only on self-discipline, but on the traditional institutions that anchor self-discipline, the military, religion, family values. And one of the things that I think educated people often don't know is that more education in the US strongly predicts less religion, less respect for the military, and more support for abortion rights as opposed to traditional, quote, traditional families. Those are all class-linked values that tie back to these central class culture gaps. What culture wars do is they tap into the class culture gap to sculpt class anger into racism, culture wars, and masculinity contests. We need to sculpt it back. But the first step in doing that is understanding the class culture gap so we can bridge it. So remember, centering blue-collar jobs is important, but it's not the only thing. John Fetterman is a good example of the other thing that we need to do, which is to build a cultural connection with non-college voters. Wearing a suit doesn't make me any smarter, he said, and look at the way he dresses. He's sending a very strong message of working class style and respect for working class style. And remember when Mehmet Oz, his opponent, was talking about crudité, Fetterman, who's brilliant at Twitter, said in Pennsylvania, we call this a veggie tray. Again, he's talking American. He's not talking fancy. He's talking regular. John Fetterman also enacts the kind of decent man blue collar stereotype. I had a stroke. I survived it. I'm truly so grateful to still be here today. I know politics can be nasty, but even then, I could never imagine ridiculing someone for their health challenges. Now, he said this in Pennsylvania. In rural areas, as you know, 1/3 of people either have, well, first of all, they have terrible health. There's a huge health class gap. And 1/3 people in rural areas either have been addicted themselves or have a close family member or friend who've been addicted. So here he was connecting with that experience. Also, Fetterman, of course, defended blue-collar jobs. He defended fracking jobs. He said, if that saves 1,200 jobs in Pennsylvania, that's enough for me. Note, though, that Fetterman did not sell out on abortion rights. He did not sell out on criminal justice. He championed amnesty for prisoners and got into fights in Pennsylvania over that. So Fetterman's is not the only way to build a cultural connection. This is an article, I've been speaking from an article I wrote in Politico about Fetterman, but I wrote a subsequent article in The Hill looking at 6 different red to blue Democrats and showing how in a wide variety of ways they built a cultural connection. So I just wanted to go issue by issue. Let's start with COVID policy. So here's what playground design can tell you about how being clueless about class distorts public policy. The professional managerial elite, these cultural elites, very focused on self-development, also feel like super entitled to be safe. I noticed this as I went to a farmer's market. I go to 2 farmer's markets. One of them is chiefly immigrants and poor people, and the other is chiefly upper middle class people. The poor people, the upper middle class people had masks over every orifice for many, many, many months. That was not true of the other one because they didn't feel they just had more pressing things that they needed to attend to, and they didn't feel entitled, and many of them weren't entitled to that level of safety. I know because I ran a worker hotline throughout COVID, and they had to go to work, and many of these people had to go to work, and we talked to people who subsequently died because of COVID. The other thing about COVID policy that people didn't really pick up on is there's a real resentment against experts among these middle status people. Resentment against experts is part and parcel of the resentment against elites. And this is actually a quote, wasn't this, Anthony, from you? You were talking to a rural person, right? And
yes, from somebody in Eastern Kentucky, yes.
Yeah, why did I refuse to get the COVID vaccine? Opioids. They told us opioids were safe too. There is a deep suspicion of the value of experts, which is part of the expression of anger against the college-educated elites who control these people's everyday lives. There's one famous quote talking about college kids. This is a blue-collar guy. College kids who don't know S about my life, but are perfectly willing to tell me how to do my job. That's the resentment against professionals. And that COVID policy was completely unaware that you have to bridge that divide before you have effective public health. Another thing that COVID policy was very clueless about is that lots of men have always opposed masks. This goes back to the 19th century and before, because what do you do is to be a real man? You don't cower in a corner. You go out there and embrace risk. Now, I'm not saying that I'm against masks or I'm against vaccines. All I'm saying is let's message both of them in order to bridge the diploma divide rather than drive non-college voters into the arms of the far right. Also, let's talk about talk. Different classes have different talk traditions. Sincerity versus irony. Fetterman said, out here in the middle of Pennsylvania, I live in an irony-free zone. Why is irony a class act, an enactment of class status? Basically, elites used to enact class status through high culture, whereas low culture was left to non-elites. That eroded about 30 years ago. But now when elites embrace low culture, they do it in an ironic fashion. That is viewed as sophistication by elites. By non-elites, it's viewed as condescension and being just stuck up. So there's a real dichotomy between sophisticated talk and straight talk. Fox News, again, they understand all of this with unbelievable, depressing insight, depressing to me anyway. They embrace this blue-collar, confrontative, and masculinist style. They're sending the same message that Fetterman was sending. We value your culture. We know where you're coming from. This is why, quote, woke language, some of which, keep in mind, I helped invent, literally, I helped invent, plays into the hands of the far right. I'm not saying we have to abandon values. I'm saying we have to talk so that people can hear us. You often hear Democrats talk about policy. The right talks about emotions. Not really true. Both parties talk in ways that affirm the identities of their key audiences. When Elizabeth Warren says, I have a policy for that, she is signaling, I'm an intelligent person. I know you're an intelligent person. She is affirming the identity of her college-educated audience. On the other hand, when Trump uses his very direct, often coarse language, he is sending a very different message about who is his core audience. How about gun control? Well, gun control is about men and masculinity, very importantly, although women are also play into the script. Women can endorse hegemonic masculinity just as much as men can. But men are 11 points less likely to support increased gun control. When you don't, there's actually an amazing Obama quote that I just discovered yesterday about this. Guns are linked with manhood, particularly in a context where, because of the nosedive of blue-collar jobs and the farm economy, many, many men who are non-college grads feel like they have lost their ability to be providers. And that is a central part of men's identity. I would argue across class, but certainly in blue collar context. And so again, they seek baskets they can fill and focus on the protector role. And that's why the right has been able to make such hay out of gun control. In that context, even using the language of control, that's exactly what a real man doesn't allow other people to do to them. Now, I'm not saying that we abandon gun safety, but I'm saying that we talk about it in a way that doesn't play into the hands of our opponents. So how about flip the script? Today, dads can't protect their small children. Dads have their 6-year-olds cowering under desks. That's not being a protector, the kind of protector that you as a dad want to be. And use male messengers, not moms. I have studied feminism, but more deeply, I studied gender. This is gender. How about climate change? Well, I'm seeking funding to try out 3 alternative messages. First, we need, sad but true, the old economy, energy jobs are drying up. But we've got your back. We want to make sure that you have a family-sustaining job in the new energy economy. That's number one message. Another message is, sad but true, farmers are finding they can't grow what their fathers and grandfathers grew. We need action now to protect our way of life, and preserve our rural values. That's number 2. And then number 3 is, what is complicated about this? The world is burning up, and we have a bunch of ignorant climate deniers, science deniers, who don't even understand what science means. Those are 3 very different climate change messages. I would love to do a poll and to figure out the college, non-college, rural, and urban breakdown among those 3 messages. Just a few more. Gay marriage. Gay marriage was a stunning success. It has been the key as a social justice warrior for literally my entire professional life. This is the one that won. This is the transformative change of my lifetime. Support for gay marriage rose from 44% to 71% in just about 10 years. What worked? Tapping family values. You need to talk to people by connecting with moral precepts that they already endorse. We're just trying to be good parents. We're just trying to be to marry the people we love and be faithful to them in a traditional marriage. It was all about family values. So that was phenomenally successful. We won the battle. And then what did we do? We lost the war. It's now more dangerous to be a trans person in many places in the country than it was 5 years ago. And one of the reasons is that we allowed ourselves to be dragged into the arena of trans rights. Non-elites are more tied into traditional masculinities and femininities. For working class girls, being looked at still presents one of the only ways they can escape from the routines of domestic drudgery and poorly paid work. Also, if you think about it, people who can't meet class ideals get very married to meeting gender ideals. Those are social ideals they can meet. That's really a form of social honor available to make up for what is often called the hidden injuries of class. So I'm not proposing we abandon trans youth. I'm proposing we've been played in a way that has hurt the LGBTQ community. The last one, immigration. In my crowd, it's like we're the sophisticated cosmopolitans. They're the parochial ethno-nationalists. But in that scrum for social honor, Non-elites are typically more patriotic than elites are. The reason is that, for example, being American is one of the only high status categories that they belong to. And again, people seek baskets they can fill. Whereas for elites, I don't need to focus on the fact that I'm American. I'm a member of a global elite. To me, stressing my cosmopolitanism is the way is my move in the scrum for social honor. So again, this is something that that this feeds what are called feeling rules. Among my crowd, we all know who we are supposed to feel really empathetic, guilty, concerned about their welfare. Certainly people of color, at LGBTQ, and immigrants. On the other hand, feeling empathetic and bonded with people who suffer various forms of very serious social disadvantage, people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ, and then leaving out and heaping scorn on the one group who on the form of social disadvantage experienced by people disadvantaged by class, that doesn't help immigrants. That puts a target on immigrants' back. And so really the message about immigration is that the way to lead to a decency in immigration policy is to do a couple things. Number one, change those emotion rules. And number two, to focus people's attention on that immigration is really about the price of a burger. It's about people in low-wage jobs that many Americans don't want after they're teenagers, that immigrants take and drive down everyday prices on the kitchen table of these middle status workers. Again, it's by thinking about it from their point of view, not abandoning immigrants, but changing not only messaging, but the way we think about things. So that's me. I have a new book coming out in 2024. I think it's called Class Dismissed, because Erica just gave me the title. I look forward to your comments and questions. And check out the Diploma Divide website. We'd appreciate any suggestions on it.
Thank you so much, Joan. After folks can absorb that last one, Joan, if you would stop sharing, and
Yes.
then we'll open it up to the gallery of folks. I know there's been quite a bit of conversation in the chat and some specific questions as well. As we shift to the full gallery, I'm going to ask you to clarify one thing that might be a term that not everybody's familiar with, Joan, which is you referred a few times in your early slides to the Brahman Left. Would you say a little bit more about who that is or how you define that?
The Brahman Left is me. It's really cultural elites. It's Thomas Piketty's term for cultural elites, and who tend to be very, very liberal.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So the Brahmin has that connotation of the top of the social hierarchy. Yes, yep. Okay, thank you. So
Anthony, I want to lift up one question from Cynthia that I think is sort of like foundational to the whole talk. So maybe it'd be good to address it first, which is with a lot of this stuff that you were talking about of like the different values and worldviews around masking and all these other things that you talked about. Did you look at whether that applies across race, or are you looking at it only for the white working class?
I have worked incredibly hard to get crosstabs by race and class. Certainly the voting pattern goes across race at this point. Now, it's true that white working class is much more likely to vote Republican than people of color who are non-college voters. But because we lose the white working class so dramatically, we need overwhelming support among people of color. And what we've seen is that people of color are shifting right. Not as much as whites do, but very significantly, which means that we no longer have a coalition. In terms of the, I would love to have crosstab information on things like masking. I look for it. The problem is it's very expensive to create, folks, because you have to survey a lot of people and very heavily over sample of people of color in order to be able to break them down by college, non-college. That's one of the reasons I'm seeking money for polling.
Thank you, Joan. We have a couple of raised hands, and I know, Erica, you're going to continue to look through the chat. The first one came from, I don't know your name, just the title of your Zoom handle is Academic Achievement. Would you come off mute and tell us who you are?
Yeah, hi, sorry, it's my work ID and I got to change it before I logged on. So I think what you're talking about is really crucial. And I'm wondering, since time is of the essence, whether you have some specific suggestions about how and when these kinds of conversations are going to occur and what venues, because I don't have a lot of opportunities to have these cross-cultural talks. And it seems to me that one of the more valuable places for these kinds of linguistic changes to take place is in the media, the way the media talks about the issues. It would make a huge difference if media people would stop talking about gun control and use the terms gun safety. So how do we get that kind of shift to happen? And how do we as individuals find a venue for these kinds of conversations?
Well, thanks for the question. The media is definitely a big problem in this regard. Many reporters used to be non-college grads a generation ago. That is no longer true. Now, if you get a reporter job, you're almost invariably a college grad, typically from a very highfalutin institution. So you're right that the media, the left media, or even the mainstream media, exacerbates these problems. That's one of the reasons in the Diploma Divide website, I basically have messaging do's and don'ts in the hopes that reporters will read that. There are other members of the working group, the media scholars, who are trying to work with people who are looking to launch a left media, a truly left media that would solve some of these problems and avoid the obvious pitfalls and start to talk in ways that are beckoning to people without college degrees. I think in terms of your personal thing, it's great if you go out and talk to people, but there's lots of books. My White Working Class book basically talks about the diploma divide, the class culture gap and how to bridge it. I have an earlier book called Reshaping the Work-Family Debate. But at the back of the White Working Class book, I basically have a reading list. You can learn what the class culture gap is all about and think up your own ways to bridge it if you read the books in the end of on that reading list. It's a short reading list, but it's an important one.
Thank you for the question, and thanks, Joan. And also, I would say a similar thing for Ruby. There's a tremendous amount of, including some of Joan's work, on our website. And one of the places you can start to integrate this different thinking and talking is if you're involved in any political campaigns, because oftentimes political campaigns, if they're on the liberal side, they default automatically to this class divide and the language divide and the cultural affectations and all that. So try to implement some of this in how you participate in a local, state, or federal campaign.
And check out the Diploma Divide. Check out the Diploma Divide little these little roadmaps. Takes less than 6 minutes to read, and they are designed in part for political campaigns. Those are on the www.diplomadivide.org. So both Ruby and the Diploma Divide have a lot of resources for campaigns.
Thanks, Joan. David Newman. You need to come
I
off
think
mute.
you're on mute.
Come off mute, David.
Yeah, unmute. There we go. Yeah, I wanted to comment on something that could address directly the urban-rural aspect of the divide, and that is getting people in urban areas aware of the problems with our food supply and how that's linked to industrial agriculture, which has really undermined the fabric of rural America, and smaller cities, which of course created a lot of blue collar jobs. So there needs to be some kind of way to communicate better. And one way is around the Farm Bill. I'm working with a group in Seattle, 350 Seattle, has an ag team, an agriculture team. We've got some people with expertise. There's that word again, expertise, in agroecology and better farming. And it's easy to see what's wrong with the Farm Bill, but very few people in the urban areas are engaged with it. And yet here we are going to the supermarket and buying industrial food all the time. It's been a part of our lives practically forever. I mean, I'm 87 years old, and it's been all my lifetime and all my parents' lifetime. It goes back to the middle of the 19th century. And so it's something that needs fixing. Right now, the Farm Bill is constructed to favor commodities, particularly corn and soybeans, most of which go to feed cattle in feedlots, which create
David,
a
I'm
lot
gonna,
of
David, I'm gonna ask you
so there's
to,
a lot of problems with this that people need to know about, and that all of this is a threat to our food supply, especially in the face of
Totally.
climate change.
Totally get it, David. I mean,
Yeah.
I was sharing with the Ruby folks that yesterday I finished a chapter called Why is Rural Red? And one of the things I point out there is that we have not only sharply increased inequality between individuals and classes, which is the way we usually look at it, but sharply increased inequality between regions, urban, rural in particular. And you cannot have that kind of inequality between regions with the political system that we have that overweights rural and Rust Belt votes. It just doesn't work. But I think we need to start a conversation about inequality between regions, and that if you care about inequality, you care about inequality not only on the blue coasts, you care about that people should be able to live anywhere in the United States, in one of the richest countries in the world, and have a decent life. And you're right, the impact of neoliberalism on the farm economy is a very important use case for that.
thank you. Bucky.
Thank you for your talk. It seems to me that a lot of the divide and resentment that you've been talking about is an outgrowth of decades, generations of a consensus of that meritocracy is the best way to do things. And it has infected all of our institutions in ways that are continuing whether we talk about them or not. And it seems like we're having a discussion about how to bridge the conversation without talking about how to change a system that disrespects many people, starting in our schools. Somebody in the chat mentioned, what about community colleges? It seems like our whole system is still on autopilot in terms of meritocracy is the greatest thing we got going. And I'm
Well-
wondering how we work on that as well as work on how we talk about that.
Well, being a college professor, I believe in meritocracy. I also believe that our winner-take-all society has completely distorted meritocracy. And so that so-called meritocratic credentials have basically become a way of justifying the continued class privilege of elites. And for the upper middle class, meritocracy, the distortion of meritocracy has led to this complete culture of overwork and overpressure on upper middle class kids who now report higher levels of anxiety and depression than inner city kids. That's how bad it has gotten. The current distortions of meritocracy are not only hurting and insulting non-college grads, they are not working for the people who supposedly have merit. It's time to change this system that is not working for anyone. In the Diploma Divide working group, we have two of the major people, Michael Sandel and Dan Markowitz, who have launched very searching critiques of the current expression of meritocracy. I mean, I went to Yale, Harvard, and MIT. Harvard has as many people from the 1% as it does from the top 1% as the bottom 60%. And I don't think that's because they're smarter.
Thank you, Joan. And yeah, again, Bucky, just to reinforce that, I think that when we're talking about language, we all, certainly at Ruby, we recognize, as important as that is, better language rather than worse language, it's only a piece of it. There's public policy, there's fundamental changes in the economic system, et cetera. Absolutely. Before we take another of the raised hands, I'm going to turn.
Anthony, and it also has to do with whose priorities we give priority to. The Brahman left cannot insist that their priorities be given precedence 100% of the time. Why? That is self-defeating, and it's also an expression of class privilege that is inconsistent with being a progressive.
Thank you. Yeah. Erica, if you could maybe come up with a question or perhaps a couple of related questions for Joan from the chat.
Sure. There have been so many good ones in the chat, y'all. I can barely keep up, but this has come up a couple times, so let me pose it. What's the role of community colleges and trade schools? First of all, like, where do those graduates fall on the Diploma Divide? And also, what should we be thinking of in terms of like how those programs could be part of the solution?
Where they fall is that they're non-college grads and they tend to vote like non-college grads. They're part of the solution. I mean, I just focus on the college debt. The Democrats have been very focused on relief of college debt. If you haven't gone to college because you didn't figure you could afford it, you were not enthusiastic about paying for the college of someone who did go to college. You were just not that enthusiastic. That said, Democrats are between a rock and the hard place because we have this insane, part of this distortion of meritocracy is the college financing system, which has made going to college basically mean that you mortgage your future, even if you come from an upper middle class family. And so the kids are furious and insist on college debt relief. Thus, the path forward is to say that we have to build an America where anyone who's willing to apply themselves and work hard has a stable middle class future. And that includes people who go to community college and enter important jobs like X-ray technician. That includes people who go into manufacturing and become mechanics and fix my toilet when I sorely need it, an important job. That also includes college grads who play important roles in the society too, but we can't privilege one group over the other. And so we don't need college debt relief. We need an educational system and public financing for people to become adults who have the ability to give back to the society in important ways through hard work. That's what we need.
Thank you, Joan. And thanks for also being so concise in your answers, Joan. And I'll keep continuing to encourage our questioners to be equally concise. Eric, I'm going to give you one more chance from the chat, and then we're going to go back to the raised hands with John next.
Yeah, so this one's going to be really important now headed into the election. So a couple people were really curious, since Democrats spend so much time talking about the threat to democracy as like a key strategy for preventing Trump from getting reelected, why is that not resonating with rural or working class voters? Or is it? I think the assumption in the question is that it's not. So is it? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I love the quote. Democracy at risk has been coded to mean those ignorant, low educated, dangerous voters. It's become the newest form of class insult. And so it's just literally playing into the hands of the far right. Again, thinking of rural areas as an example, or rust belts, there are a lot of people in this country for whom democracy has not delivered for over 30 years. They don't have a lot of faith in democracy. They think Republicans are in the pocket of big business, and the Democrats either are too or are completely ineffectual. At any rate, they see their communities dying, and they're very, very, very angry about it. So let's make sure, let's hear them, treat them with respect, say the path forward is to make government work for you again, rather than scolding them of like, you are, this just shows how ignorant you are. Now you're trashing my democracy. It's become the newest form of class insult, which is a true tragedy, because that plays into the hands of exactly the far right people who are threatening our democracy.
Thank you. Okay, next question's from John. If you'll come off mute, great.
Good afternoon, Ms. Williams, Mr. Flacavento. First off, my apologies for getting here late. I was on an Army phone call and it ran long.
Go ahead, John.
So I am working class and I live in rural Southeast Kentucky. And we talked earlier a little bit about left media. My local Democratic Party, of which I'm a member of, we are actually planning to create basically a local alternative newspaper and just give it to working class people, you know, with our spin on reality. The question I have for you is, what do you think it would take for working class people to change their party registration from Republican to Democrat if we were to ask them to? And I do have a hypothesis for what I think the answer might be, but I wanted to get your take because, you know, I don't know if my hunch is right or not.
I'd love to hear your hunch, because I'd like to know where you're coming from, John.
So, again, in the Army, I'm a officer, and along the way, I learned about something called self-categorization theory, which is a psychological theory of leadership that has a fair bit of research behind it. So my hunch, based on that theory, is that one, you have to have a very, very sharp line between us and them, and two, you have to draw that line so that there are as many people on the us side as possible. So kind of going off of what's been said earlier, you know, maybe instead of calling for a jubilee of all student debt, why not call for a jubilee of all debt? Student debt, mortgage debt, medical debt, credit card debt. You get the bottom 90% behind you on a very, very clear, extremely sharp message that has a very sharp dividing line between supporters and non-supporters. And you know, it seems to be what populists of all stripes tend to do a lot of. And I'm thinking what would happen if the political left were to do that in reverse.
I do think that we on the left have lost touch with the psychological reality, which is very robustly documented, that the identities that you trigger are going to become salient. So the far right is triggering very divisive identities, class, by like race, wokeism, etc. What we need to be doing is to be triggering identities that bring people together. And I say this as again, San Francisco liberal: patriotism, nationalism, divorced from racism. But this country is a great country. It's very flawed. It's a great country. We're proud to be here. Robust support for that, not only among working class whites, but especially among Latinos. So we need to be triggering not divisive identities, but shared identities. That doesn't mean that we lose touch with structural racism, lose touch with gender privilege. It does not mean that. We can still pursue those projects, but we don't want to be playing into the hands of the far right by triggering divisive identities.
Thank you. So John, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to move on to the next question. Thanks for that, John. So Sherry, if you would come off mute and have
Can I just say one more thing? The race class narrative that you folks may have heard of does exactly what I propose. It does not back off of racial justice, but it does trigger bridging identities.
Yes, and Ruby has some information on the website and are proponents of the race class narrative. So thanks for bringing that in. Okay, Sherry, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I'm here in central Pennsylvania. And one thing that I've been curious about is I know that John Fetterman has a huge following around the country among progressives. And some of my San Francisco friends in the Mission were huge fans of him practically before I even knew who he was. But here in central Pennsylvania, he actually didn't play that well. People didn't like the way he dressed, and Josh Shapiro really outperformed him by several points. I was wondering if you had an analysis of why people here might prefer a Shapiro to a Fetterman.
You know, Sherry, I wish I'm not close enough to be able to give you useful insights. I'm so sorry, but
I mean, I don't expect you to necessarily micromanage like Pennsylvania politics, but I think it's worth considering, and I submit that respectfully as a potential critique.
Josh Shapiro,
people in the rural areas often do like a politician who is professional and seems to take his job, with a certain amount of gravitas as is inflected by his sartorial choices or something. So I think Fetterman gets a lot of attention among people, but I'm not entirely sure whether it's deserved for the reasons that are often attributed to him.
Well, in the Hill article that followed the article on Fetterman, Josh Shapiro is one of the people who I highlight as building a cultural connection with non-college voters. He has a very different style. He enacts a very different form of masculinity. But I think I don't think we have to choose between them. I think, people have to do something that's authentic to them, because if working class people value anything, it's authenticity. So everybody is not going to dress in shorts and be a great tweeter like John Fetterman is. He is pretty much guaranteed to be a darling of the elite. And I think your underlying point is we have to be attentive to what's going to connect with rural voters, not what connects with us here in San Francisco. I'm in favor of that.
Thank you. We've got, we're at 3 minutes after 5. Joan, are you willing to go another 5 minutes?
Very happy, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so folks, I'll just say again for everybody if people need to begin dropping off, feel free to do so. But we've been very privilege to have Joan Williams leading this discussion. Very glad to have all of you, and hope to see you next month. And then we'll continue until, we'll go till 5:10. So Elizabeth, you are next.
So I've noticed in this conversation, you said you believed in meritocracy, and I'm assuming that college education is the key to the top.
No,
And I get this.
Just to interrupt you, I'm one of the very early people right after the election that said we tried the college for all plan, we didn't deliver. It's not going to happen. We need all alternative paths. Just to clarify. Whoops, I think you're now on mute. Yeah.
I'm not on mute.
Okay, go ahead, Elizabeth.
I feel sometimes that people do not understand that rural people often don't want an education. They don't want to pay for higher education because there is no need for it out here. I have 3 adult children and only one has graduated from college. The other 2 said that is a waste of money because the jobs around here do not require a college degree. And that doesn't make them less intelligent. That doesn't make them less human beings. But yet I still feel this, what you want to call it, but a little bit of looking down on people in rural areas, and as if the point is they choose not to go to college because they know they are smart enough to know what's going to get them ahead.
I believe the college.
I don't think people understand that.
I do. I think you're right. I think many people don't understand that, Elizabeth. Believe me, I do understand that. I think that college is not the only place where you can find smart people. I believe that college should not be the only path to a honored future. I believe that the guy who comes and fixes my car or fixes my HVAC is doing something as important as me, who sit around writing words on pieces of paper that largely nobody reads. I think that I believe in meritocracy in the sense that if you're in college, you should be graded based on the skills that are valued in college. It seems that, and your question really gives me something to think about, even using the term meritocracy is sending a message that I don't intend to send. I totally understand that many people do not want to go to college and that they need college like a hole in the head. College should not be the only path to honor or stability.
Ironically, some of the most highly educated people where I live are farmers because they need to be, but they are the minority. So
thank you.
Anyway,
thank you for that. As a farmer, thank you for that, Elizabeth. As a farmer myself,
I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Great. I think we have time for possibly 2 more if the questions and answers are short. From Clarice, and then we'll end with Karen and Bruce. Clarice, go ahead.
I am from far upstate Idaho, and really rural. And I just want to tackle one little different thing on what I heard from John. I really understand what he's saying. Just a little bit different look at it. His desire to move Republicans to Democrats, yes, we're for that. I think one of the things that would have helped in my state, and probably a lot of other states like Idaho, is if we had what volunteers are trying very hard in Idaho now to get on the books for the election in November, and that's open primaries. Because by open primaries, not requiring you to declare a primary or a party in order to vote in the primary, which is so crucial, but so underused. There aren't that many voters going into the primaries because they think, like in Idaho, what's the use? But if they're allowed to vote for the person instead of the party, I think that's going to help us a lot to get people over to looking at things like Democrats do.
If you want to save democracy, change the primary system. I think you really put your finger on it. What's really trashing democracy is the primary system right now.
Yes. So Reclaim Idaho in Idaho is doing a really good job trying to get that on the books. And this is the best we've done in the 3 initiatives we put out. So hope for us.
God bless is all I can say.
And we're really proud to be sort of associated with Reclaim Idaho. It's a fantastic group. So hats off to you there. Okay, we're gonna wrap up, I think, with the final question from, looks like from Bruce.
Yeah, just 3 phenomena very quickly. First, even progressive voices in rural areas in Georgia are generally not successful in persuading their family, friends, neighbors on the kinds of issues you've been talking about. Second, all of the right-wing elite, for example, in the Georgia state legislature, they're college graduates, and many of them have advanced degrees. And I've dealt with them extensively for 10 years, and they are true believers. They are true believers. They're not doing it because they're afraid of their constituents. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, in 20 years of dealing with these issues, very frequently, I personally, the hostility on the part of many people who have the kinds of views you're talking about is so strong and so overt and so immediate that it's extremely hard in many cases to get any kind of dialogue going. And I'm talking about physical confrontations, things of that kind, and not generated, certainly by people like me. The feelings are so strong that it represents a major, major obstacle in many cases to even begin a conversation.
Look at the interaction between Elizabeth and me. We had we thought we were on different sides of an issue because I didn't choose my words carefully enough, Elizabeth. I totally own that. It turned out when we talked with each other, we were on similar sides of an issue. I think what we have now is a situation where we have cultural dysfunction poisoning politics. We have to pay attention to the cultural dimensions of politics and the deep identity investments and identity threats that are driving the horrible emotional tone of American politics. What I'm trying to do is to rebuild this relationship so that people can talk to each other with respect, not just message things differently, but have the kind of conversation that Elizabeth and I had, where you say, okay, you're a human being, I'm a human being, we may not agree, let's look at it, but we're not deeply threatening each other's identities in a way that drives this real poison that is making it that's splitting families, not to mention the nation.
So we're going to need to wrap up. Thank you for all the excellent questions, both in the chat and verbalized. Bruce, I'd love to continue that conversation. I'm not sure if you were referring when you talked about the visceral, hostile responses about the elected representatives or rank and file folks, but it's a conversation we can have offline. I personally find that in rural areas, at least in Appalachia, actually folks are fairly easy to talk to, even across disagreement. That doesn't mean you can always reach common ground, but I don't find, generally speaking, it's not the norm that everything is met with such hostility, not among everyday folks at least. But I want to wrap up again by thanking Joan for an extremely informative and well-constructed presentation, for your concise and insightful responses to questions, and for the great questions, great comments in the dialogue. We had a lot of other things in the dialogue that were sort of a conversation of their own right. Please get involved with Ruby if you're not already. Please check out the Diploma Divide working group and the Diploma Divide website, because 2024 is an enormously important year, as we all know, and there are constructive, productive things we can do, not just to win the critical elections, as critical as that is, but to begin to chip away at these ridiculous things that are dividing us. I think we can really make some progress there. So thanks to everybody. Joan, terrific. And we will see you all next month.
Thank you.